The flight that changed everything. Gordon Wallace strode through the crowded airport terminal, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. His leather briefcase swung at his side, a symbol of his success and meticulous nature. Everything about Gordon exuded control, from his tailored suit to the precise way he adjusted his tie. He thrived on order, despised chaos, and had little patience for delays. As he approached the check-in counter, he scanned the crowd with a look of barely concealed disdain. Families with crying children, backpackers in wrinkled clothes, and travelers wearing oversized headphones cluttered his path. Gordon grumbled under his breath, his irritation mounting. He hated flying, not because of fear, but because it meant surrendering control to someone else, someone he didn't know. When he reached the counter, the attendant greeted him with a polite smile. "Good afternoon, sir. May I have your ID and ticket, please?" Gordon slid his documents across the counter. Wallace. Gordon Wallace. First class on Flight 218. The attendant checked her screen. "Thank you, Mr. Wallace. Your flight will begin boarding in approximately 45 minutes. 45 minutes. He snapped. "It's already late. What's the holdup?" "I apologize for the inconvenience, sir. The crew is finalizing preparations for departure." With a sharp exhale, Gordon snatched his boarding pass and stormed off toward security. He detested inefficiency, and today seemed determined to test his limits. As he navigated the terminal, his annoyance grew. Travelers shuffled aimlessly, and announcements crackled overhead. By the time he reached his gate, he was wound tighter than ever. At gate C14, a group of airline staff caught his attention. Two pilots stood near the boarding desk, reviewing their tablets. One was a tall black woman with a commanding presence and an immaculate uniform. Beside her stood a Latina co-pilot, her expression calm and focused. Gordon's lips pressed into a thin line. "This has to be a joke," he muttered under his breath. The idea of these women piloting his flight made his chest tighten. He prided himself on being reasonable, but this was too much. Without hesitation, he approached the gate attendant. "Excuse me," Gordon said, his voice low but firm. "Are those the pilots for this flight?" The young attendant looked up from his screen, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Yes, sir. That's Captain Monroe and First Officer Rivera." "Is there an issue?" "Yes, there's an issue," Gordon said, his tone frosty. "I'm not comfortable with them flying this plane. I want a different crew." The attendant blinked, caught off guard. "Sir, Captain Monroe is one of our most experienced pilots. She has over 12 years of flight experience and an impeccable record." "That's irrelevant," Gordon interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "I paid for this ticket, and I have the right to feel safe." A calm but firm voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Gordon turned to see Captain Monroe standing a few feet away. She was tall and composed, her dark eyes unwavering. Her uniform was impeccable, her posture radiating confidence. Yet, to Gordon, her presence only intensified his unease. "I was just explaining," he said, his tone sharp, "that I'm not comfortable flying with this crew. I'm requesting a change." Captain Monroe stepped closer, her expression neutral but resolute. "This is your assigned crew, sir. If you're uncomfortable, you're welcome to rebook with another airline." Her words hung in the air, daring him to push further. Passengers nearby began to murmur, their curiosity piqued. Gordon felt their eyes on him, their judgment palpable. His face flushed, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "I'll board," he said through gritted teeth, "but I'll be watching." Captain Monroe didn't flinch. "That's your prerogative, sir. My team and I are fully prepared to ensure a safe flight." With that, she turned and walked away, her authority unmistakable. Gordon stood there for a moment, seething. He grabbed his boarding pass from the attendant and marched onto the jet bridge. As he settled into his first-class seat, Gordon's irritation simmered. He glanced at the cockpit door, the knowledge of who was behind it gnawing at him. He adjusted his seatbelt with unnecessary force, determined to remain on edge. When a flight attendant approached to offer him a drink, he waved her away, his mood as dark as the storm clouds brewing outside. The pre-flight announcements began, but Gordon barely registered the words. His focus remained on the cockpit door, a physical barrier between him and the person he didn't trust. The engines hummed to life, and the plane began to taxi. As it accelerated down the runway, Gordon gripped the armrests, his knuckles white. The ascent was smooth, but his anxiety lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was in danger. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and measured. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Monroe. We're cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet and expect a smooth flight to Denver. Thank you for choosing Skystream Airlines." Her voice grated on him, not because it was unsteady, but because it wasn't. How could she be so composed when he felt anything but? Around him, other passengers appeared relaxed. A man across the aisle typed on his laptop, while a mother entertained her toddler with a coloring book. Didn't they care who was flying this plane? The turbulence hit without warning, a sudden jolt that sent drinks spilling and passengers gripping their seats. Gordon's stomach lurched, his worst fears materializing. The seatbelt sign chimed, and Captain Monroe's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, secure the cabin." Her tone remained steady, but Gordon's panic rose. He glanced around, searching for someone who shared his alarm. The woman beside him gave him a sideways glance. "Nervous flyer?" she asked. "I'm fine," he snapped, though his hands told a different story as they gripped the armrests tightly. The turbulence grew worse, the plane shuddering with each wave of air. Gordon felt the weight of his doubts crushing him. Every bump confirmed his belief that the crew wasn't up to the task. Yet as the minutes passed, the plane stabilized, the turbulence subsiding as quickly as it had arrived. Captain Monroe's voice came over the intercom again. "We've passed through the turbulence. Thank you for your patience." The calm returned to the cabin, but not to Gordon. He remained stiff, his mind racing. He hated feeling powerless, and this flight had stripped him of all control. For the first time in years, he wondered if his certainty in his own judgment had been misplaced. A test of confidence. The turbulence might have subsided, but Gordon's internal storm raged on. He sat stiffly in his seat, his eyes fixed on the cockpit door, as if sheer force of will could change who was piloting the plane. The cabin had returned to a state of calm, but his mind was anything but. He glanced out the window, the endless expanse of clouds doing little to soothe his nerves. Below, the ground was invisible, shrouded in the thick, white mist of the stratosphere. Gordon tapped his fingers against the armrest, his movements agitated. His thoughts churned, replaying the earlier confrontation with Captain Monroe. Her calm demeanor had unnerved him, not because it was unprofessional, but because it had challenged everything he thought he knew about leadership and competence. The woman seated beside him interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "You know," she began casually, not looking at him, "your wound tighter than a spring. Want to talk about it?" Gordon turned to her, startled. "I'm fine," he replied curtly. She raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Sure you are. You've been glaring at that cockpit door like it insulted you personally. Why do you care?" He snapped, his tone sharper than he intended. The woman leaned back in her seat, unbothered by his attitude. "I don't really. Just thought I'd offer a distraction. Flying makes a lot of people nervous." "I'm not nervous," he said firmly. "I just don't trust that this plane is in the right hands." Her gaze sharpened. "Ah, so it's not the flying you're worried about. It's the pilot." Gordon's jaw tightened. "That's none of your business." "Maybe not," she replied, her tone light, but her words pointed. "But if you're sitting here doubting someone who's probably more qualified than anyone else on this plane, that seems like your business, doesn't it?" He turned away, unwilling to engage further. The last thing he needed was a lecture from a stranger. But her words stuck with him, poking at the edges of his self-assurance. The flight attendants began their rounds, offering snacks and beverages. Gordon declined, too restless to eat or drink. He noticed the way the crew moved with practiced efficiency, their smiles genuine but their focus sharp. They worked as a cohesive unit, each action purposeful. It was a stark contrast to the chaos Gordon felt within himself. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane cruised through the skies. Most passengers settled into their routines, watching movies, reading books, or drifting off to sleep. Gordon, however, couldn't relax. He shifted in his seat, crossing and uncrossing his legs, his thoughts a tangled mess. Then the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Monroe. We've been informed of a developing weather system ahead. To ensure the smoothest possible ride, we'll be adjusting our flight path. We'll keep you updated as necessary. Thank you for your understanding." Her tone was calm and composed, but Gordon's anxiety spiked. He glanced around the cabin, searching for any sign of unease among the other passengers. There was none. People continued with their activities, unfazed by the announcement. But Gordon couldn't shake the unease growing in his chest. He leaned toward the window, trying to catch a glimpse of the weather system. All he saw was the same endless sea of clouds, but that didn't comfort him. His seatmate broke the silence again. "You know, it's okay to admit when you're scared." "I'm not scared," he said through gritted teeth. "Sure," she replied, her tone skeptical. "But you should ask yourself, what exactly are you afraid of? That she won't do her job, or that she'll prove you wrong?" Gordon turned to her, anger flashing in his eyes. "You don't know me." "No," she agreed, "but I can tell you're not used to being out of control. And right now, that's eating you alive." He opened his mouth to retort, but found he had no words. She was right, though he'd never admit it. Instead, he sank back into his seat, staring at the seat back in front of him. As the flight progressed, the cabin remained calm, but Gordon's thoughts were anything but. He replayed his earlier demand for a different crew, the way Captain Monroe had stood her ground. Her unwavering confidence had infuriated him, not because she was wrong, but because she hadn't flinched under his scrutiny. The plane jolted slightly, and Gordon's hands instinctively gripped the armrests. The turbulence was minor, barely noticeable, but his mind immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios. He glanced at the other passengers. No one else seemed concerned. Even the woman beside him looked unbothered, her gaze focused on a magazine she pulled from the seat pocket. The intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've successfully adjusted our flight path to avoid the weather system. Thank you for your patience. We'll be arriving at our destination on schedule." The announcement should have reassured him, but it didn't. Instead, it felt like a challenge, a reminder that Captain Monroe was handling everything with the ease and professionalism he had doubted she possessed. As the plane continued its journey, Gordon found himself reflecting on his life. He had built a career on being decisive, on making snap judgments that others respected and feared. But now, sitting in this plane with no control over his fate, he wondered if those judgments had always been as sound as he believed. The woman beside him interrupted his thoughts once more. "You know, I had a boss like you once." Gordon frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" She shrugged. He thought he knew everything, that his way was the only way. But you know what? He wasn't as smart as he thought he was. The moment he started listening to other people, things got a lot better. He bristled. "And what's your point?" "My point," she said, meeting his gaze, "is that sometimes you have to trust that other people know what they're doing, even if it doesn't look the way you expect it to." Her words hit harder than he wanted to admit. He turned back to the window, her insight gnawing at him. Maybe she was right. Maybe his distrust of Captain Monroe had less to do with her qualifications and more to do with his own insecurities. The plane began its descent, the city lights below coming into view. Gordon felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The flight was almost over, but the journey, the one inside himself, was just beginning. A crisis at 35,000 feet. The faint hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin, a constant reminder of their altitude. Gordon's tension had only deepened, despite the calm atmosphere around him. His seatmate had finally turned her attention back to her magazine, leaving him alone with his restless thoughts. The lights of the cabin dimmed slightly as the flight attendants began another round of service. Gordon declined their offer again, tapping his fingers rhythmically on the armrest. His eyes wandered to the cockpit door, the invisible barrier between him and the woman he was struggling to trust. Suddenly, a loud gasp came from a few rows behind him, followed by a panicked voice. "Help! Somebody help!" The cabin erupted into murmurs as passengers craned their necks to see what was happening. Gordon turned in his seat, his heart pounding. A man stood in the aisle, his face pale and frantic. He was leaning over a woman slumped in her seat, her head tilted unnaturally to the side. "She's not breathing," the man shouted. The murmurs turned into gasps as passengers realized the severity of the situation. A flight attendant rushed down the aisle, her face calm but her movements urgent. "Sir, please step aside," she said firmly, crouching next to the unconscious woman. She pressed 2 fingers to the woman's neck, checking for a pulse. Another flight attendant hurried to retrieve the emergency medical kit. "Is there a doctor on board?" the first attendant called out, her voice carrying over the murmurs. A woman in scrubs quickly stood up, her face serious but composed. "I'm a nurse," she said, stepping forward. "What's happening?" She collapsed, the man stammered, his voice shaking. She said she felt dizzy, and then she just stopped breathing. The nurse nodded, immediately taking charge. "Let's get her onto the floor," she said. "We need to start CPR." The flight attendants worked together, gently moving the woman into the aisle. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some murmuring prayers, others watching in stunned silence. Gordon sat frozen, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. The intercom crackled, breaking the tense silence. "Flight attendants, please report to the cockpit." Gordon's heart sank. This was it. The captain was going to have to make a critical decision. He glanced at his seatmate, who was watching the scene unfold with a mixture of concern and calm. For once, she didn't offer any commentary. In the cockpit, Captain Monroe's focus remained sharp as she assessed the situation. The lead flight attendant explained the medical emergency quickly and clearly, detailing the steps they had taken and the patient's current condition. Monroe nodded. "We'll need to expedite our landing," she said, her voice steady. "Contact air traffic control and request priority clearance. I'll inform the passengers." She adjusted the radio, her hands moving with practiced precision. Moments later, her voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Monroe. We have a medical emergency on board, and will be making an expedited landing at the nearest airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and follow the instructions of the flight attendants. Thank you for your cooperation." The passengers exchanged worried glances, the gravity of the situation settling over them. Gordon's chest tightened. This was the moment he had feared, a situation that required split-second decisions and flawless execution, and it was all in the hands of the captain he had doubted. The plane began its descent, the cabin tilting slightly as the engines adjusted. The fasten seatbelt sign illuminated, and the flight attendants moved quickly to secure the cabin. The nurse continued performing CPR, her face a mask of concentration. Gordon couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene. His earlier disdain and arrogance had been replaced by something he couldn't quite name. Fear, humility. He wasn't sure. All he knew was that this was no longer about his prejudices or his need for control. This was life and death. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Monroe's voice came over the intercom again, calm but firm. "We're coordinating with emergency services on the ground. They will meet us immediately upon landing. Please remain seated and keep the aisle clear." The reassurance in her tone sent a ripple of calm through the cabin, but Gordon felt anything but calm. He stared at the cockpit door, his thoughts racing. For all his doubts, she was in control, guiding the plane and its passengers through a crisis with unshakable composure. The plane jolted slightly as it descended through a layer of turbulence, but Monroe's steady hand kept it on course. Gordon found himself gripping the armrests again, but this time it wasn't out of anger or suspicion. It was out of sheer hope that she would get them through this. The lights of the airport came into view, the runway glowing like a lifeline in the darkness. The cabin was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The nurse continued her efforts, her movements mechanical but desperate. The plane touched down smoothly, the landing so precise it was almost imperceptible. Gordon's breath caught in his throat as the aircraft slowed and taxied toward a designated area where flashing lights from emergency vehicles awaited. As the plane came to a stop, the intercom crackled one last time. Flight attendants, disarm doors and cross-check. Emergency personnel will be boarding shortly. Please remain seated until instructed. The cabin erupted into a flurry of activity. Paramedics climbed aboard, their equipment in hand, and rushed to the unconscious woman. The nurse briefed them quickly, her voice low and efficient. Gordon watched in silence as the paramedics worked, their movements swift and practiced. The woman was loaded onto a stretcher and carefully carried off the plane, her husband following close behind, his face a mask of worry. The captain emerged from the cockpit, her expression calm but focused. She conferred briefly with the lead paramedic, nodding as they exchanged information. Then she turned to the flight attendants, her voice quiet but authoritative. Passengers began to clap, a ripple of applause spreading through the cabin. Gordon joined in reluctantly, his hands moving slowly, almost mechanically. For the first time, he felt the weight of his earlier judgment. As Captain Monroe made her way back to the cockpit, she paused near Gordon's row. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something in her gaze. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Then she was gone, leaving him with his thoughts. The aftermath of judgment. As the plane taxied to its final gate, the energy in the cabin began to shift. The immediate crisis was over, but the weight of what had just occurred lingered in the air. Conversations were hushed, the usual post-flight buzz muted by the gravity of the situation. Gordon sat in his seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For once, his usual air of confidence had vanished, replaced by something unfamiliar: uncertainty. Passengers around him began to gather their belongings, their movements deliberate but subdued. Some glanced toward the cockpit, their faces a mix of admiration and gratitude. Gordon remained seated, his gaze fixed on the seat back in front of him. His mind raced, replaying the past few hours like a tape on loop. The turbulence, the emergency, the captain's calm voice guiding them through it all. It was undeniable. Captain Monroe had proven herself in every way that mattered. And yet, the shame of his earlier assumptions sat heavy on his chest. The woman who had been sitting beside him broke the silence. That was something, huh? Gordon turned to her, his expression unreadable. Yeah, he said after a pause, his voice quieter than usual. She handled it well, the woman continued, her tone thoughtful. The captain, I mean. You've got to admit, that was impressive. He stiffened, the truth of her words stinging more than he wanted to admit. She did her job, he replied, his tone clipped. The woman raised an eyebrow, but didn't push further. Instead, she offered him a small, knowing smile and gathered her belongings. Take care, Mr. Wallace, she said, using his name for the first time. Before he could respond, she slipped into the aisle and disappeared into the flow of disembarking passengers. Gordon sat for a moment longer, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He glanced toward the cockpit door, where Captain Monroe stood, her posture relaxed but authoritative, as she thanked passengers for flying with Skystream Airlines. Her professionalism was undeniable, her calm demeanor unshaken despite the crisis they had faced. He finally stood, retrieving his briefcase from the overhead compartment. As he moved toward the exit, his steps felt heavier, as though the weight of his own judgments was slowing him down. When he reached the cockpit, he paused. Captain Monroe met his gaze, her expression polite but guarded. "Thank you for flying with us, Mr. Wallace," she said, her voice steady. For a moment, Gordon was at a loss for words. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The apology he wanted to give caught somewhere between his pride and his conscience. Finally, he managed, "Good flight." Her lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes held steady. "I'm glad we could get everyone here safely," she replied. He nodded, unable to say anything more, and stepped off the plane. As he walked through the terminal, the weight of the encounter stayed with him. The usual noise and chaos of the airport faded into the background as his thoughts took over. For the first time in years, Gordon Wallace felt small, not in stature, but in spirit. Gordon's car service was waiting for him outside the terminal, the driver holding a small sign with his name. He climbed into the back seat, setting his briefcase beside him. As the car pulled away, he leaned back, staring out the window at the blur of city lights. The ride was quiet, the driver respecting his apparent need for solitude. Gordon's mind churned, replaying the events of the day. He thought of the way Captain Monroe had handled the turbulence, the medical emergency, and the expedited landing, all with unflappable composure. He thought of his own behavior, the way he had demanded a different crew, the arrogance that had driven his actions. A memory surfaced, unbidden but sharp, his father's voice, low and stern, saying, "Never judge a man by what he looks like, Gordon. Judge him by what he does." It had been a lesson he'd heard countless times as a child, but had never fully absorbed. Now, the words echoed in his mind, a painful reminder of how far he had strayed from that wisdom. The car pulled up to his hotel, and Gordon stepped out, nodding curtly to the driver. Inside, the lobby was quiet, the polished floors reflecting the soft glow of the chandeliers. He checked in quickly and made his way to his room, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Once inside, he set his briefcase on the desk and sank into the armchair by the window. The city stretched out before him, alive with lights and movement. He reached for his phone, hesitating for a moment before opening the Notes app. The blank screen stared back at him, a canvas for the thoughts swirling in his mind. Slowly, he began to type. To Captain Monroe, "I want to start by saying I owe you an apology. When I'd boarded your flight, I made assumptions about you, about your abilities, about what kind of leader you were. Those assumptions were based on nothing more than my own biases, and for that, I am deeply sorry. Today, you proved something I should have known all along. Leadership isn't about appearances or fitting into someone else's expectations. It's about action, composure, and the ability to rise to any challenge. You exemplified all of that and more. Thank you for getting us to our destination safely, and for handling every challenge with professionalism and grace. You have my respect. Sincerely, Gordon Wallace." He stared at the message, his finger hovering over the save button. The words felt clumsy, inadequate, but they were honest. He saved the note and closed his phone, setting it on the table beside him. For the first time in what felt like years, Gordon allowed himself to sit in the discomfort of his own reflection. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But for the first time, he felt ready to confront the parts of himself he had long ignored. A mirror in the boardroom. The following morning, Gordon woke with a heavy head and an unsettled heart. Sleep had been restless, the events of the flight replaying in his mind like a haunting refrain. He sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the glowing city skyline through the hotel window. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting him from his thoughts. It was Clara, his assistant, calling to remind him of his morning schedule. "Your first meeting is at 9:30 with the executive team," she said, her voice crisp. "Thanks, Clara. I'll be there," Gordon replied, his voice gruffer than usual. He ended the call and moved to get ready, his movements mechanical. He didn't feel like the self-assured man who usually dominated those boardrooms. Something had shifted. By the time he arrived at the office, coffee in hand, the executive team was already gathered. The room buzzed with energy, the walls adorned with charts detailing quarterly performances and projections. Gordon took his place at the head of the table, his usual commanding presence subdued. "Let's get started," he said, gesturing for the first manager to begin the presentation. As the team delved into numbers and strategies, Gordon's mind wandered. He observed them in a way he hadn't before, noticing the subtle dynamics at play, the way certain voices dominated the conversation, while others hesitated to speak. Then the discussion shifted to a pressing decision, hiring a new director for one of the company's most critical divisions. 2 candidates were in the running, and the room quickly divided into factions. "She has the qualifications," said one manager, referring to a candidate named Rachel, "but I'm not sure she's the right fit for a leadership role." "She's too soft-spoken." "Soft-spoken doesn't mean ineffective," countered another. "Her track record speaks for itself. She's innovative, dependable, and her team adores her. But can she command respect?" A third voice interjected. "We need someone who can handle tough situations." Gordon leaned back in his chair, the conversation echoing uncomfortably in his mind. It sounded eerily familiar, like the internal debate he'd had about Captain Monroe. His stomach twisted as he realized how easily he might have sided with the doubters just a day ago. He cleared his throat, silencing the room. "Let me ask you something," he began, his voice measured. "What are we really basing this decision on? Is it her performance, or is it our perception of what leadership is supposed to look like?" The room fell silent, the managers exchanging uncertain glances. Gordon continued, his tone firm but thoughtful. "Leadership isn't about who's the loudest or who fits some outdated mold. It's about results. It's about composure under pressure and the ability to inspire trust. If Rachel has proven she can do that, then I don't see why we're questioning her." One of the managers hesitated before speaking. "But don't optics matter? Our clients." "Optics matter," Gordon interrupted, "but only if we let them. Our clients trust us because we deliver results, not because we conform to their expectations of who should be in charge. If we choose someone less qualified simply because they look the part, we risk losing the very trust we've built." The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Finally, one of the managers nodded. "You're right. It should be about merit, not perception." Gordon nodded, his gaze sweeping the room. "Good. Then let's move forward with the right choice." After the meeting, Clara approached him in the hallway. "That was quite a statement you made," she said, her tone tinged with curiosity. "It needed to be said," Gordon replied, his voice quieter than usual. Clara studied him for a moment. "You've been different since you got back. More reflective. What's going on?" Gordon hesitated, unsure how to put his thoughts into words. "Let's just say I had an experience that forced me to reevaluate some things." Clara's expression softened. "Well, whatever it was, I think it's a good thing. It suits you." He nodded, offering a faint smile before heading back to his office. The praise felt hollow, not because it wasn't genuine, but because he knew he still had a long way to go. That evening, Gordon found himself alone in his apartment, nursing a glass of scotch as he stared out at the city. The skyline was a blur of lights and shadows, a stark contrast to the clarity he was trying to find within himself. His phone sat on the coffee table, the email draft to Captain Monroe still unsent. He picked it up, reading the message again. The words felt right, but he couldn't shake the fear of how she might respond. Would she accept his apology? Or would she see it as too little, too late? With a deep breath, he hit send. The email disappeared into the ether, leaving him feeling both exposed and strangely lighter. For the first time in years, he had taken a step toward vulnerability, and it felt terrifyingly liberating. The next morning, Gordon received a reply. Subject: Apology. Dear Mr. Wallace, thank you for your message. I appreciate your acknowledgement of what happened and your willingness to reflect on it. It's not always easy to confront our biases, but it's an important step toward growth. As a captain, my responsibility is to ensure the safety and trust of every passenger, no matter the circumstances. I'm glad we were able to reach our destination safely, and I hope this experience has left you with a broader perspective. Best regards, Captain A. Monroe. Gordon read the email twice, his emotions a mix of relief and humility. Her words were gracious, even though she had every reason to dismiss him. It was more than he deserved, and it deepened his resolve to continue changing. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he felt something shift, not just in his professional life, but in who he was as a person. It wasn't just about Captain Monroe anymore. It was about how he moved forward, how he chose to lead, and how he chose to see others. This wasn't the end of his journey, but it was a beginning. And for Gordon Wallace, that was enough. A new legacy. 2 weeks had passed since Gordon Wallace's life-altering flight. On the surface, his days seemed unchanged. Early mornings at the office, hours spent in meetings, and nights filled with spreadsheets and strategic plans. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet transformation had begun. He found himself thinking more deeply about the people around him. The subtle dynamics in meetings, the small hesitations in a junior team member's voice, the way some employees seemed to shrink in the presence of more assertive colleagues. It all felt more vivid now, more urgent. Gordon realized he had been blind to so much for so long, focused only on results and efficiency, while overlooking the people who made it all happen. One Friday morning, as he walked into the office, he noticed a group of employees gathered near the break room. They were discussing an upcoming leadership workshop, their excitement palpable. Gordon had approved the initiative weeks ago without much thought, but now he lingered nearby, listening. "It's about identifying unconscious biases," one of the employees explained, her voice eager. "They're bringing in a guest speaker who's done amazing work with Fortune 500 companies." "That sounds interesting," another chimed in. "I didn't even realize how much bias plays into hiring and promotions until I read that article in the journal." Gordon cleared his throat, stepping into their view. "What article is that?" The employees turned to him, startled but not intimidated. "Oh, it was about how companies are rethinking traditional leadership criteria," one of them said. "They're finding that the old standards, like valuing assertiveness over collaboration, don't always produce the best results." Gordon nodded slowly. "I'd like to read that. Could you send it to me?" The employees exchanged glances, surprised but pleased. "Of course, Mr. Wallace. I'll email it to you." "Thank you," he said, his tone sincere. "And I'd like to sit in on that workshop." The surprise on their faces was almost comical, but Gordon didn't blame them. He had never shown much interest in these kinds of initiatives before, but this was different. He needed this, not just for the company, but for himself. Later that day, Gordon sat at his desk, reading the article. It outlined how traditional leadership models often ignored traits like empathy, adaptability, and emotional intelligence. The research struck a chord with him, echoing the lessons he had unwittingly learned on that fateful flight. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Clara entered, carrying a stack of papers. "The latest reports from marketing," she said, setting them on his desk. "Also, Rachel accepted the director position. She starts next week." Gordon nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Good. She's the right choice." Clara hesitated, then asked, "What made you push so hard for her? I mean, not everyone was on board at first." He leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "I realized something during that flight to Dallas. Leadership isn't about fitting a mold or meeting expectations. It's about how you handle yourself when it matters most. Rachel has that. She might not be the loudest voice in the room, but she's proven she can lead." Clara studied him for a moment, then smiled. "I think she'll do great." As she left, Gordon turned back to his computer. He opened his email and began drafting a message to Rachel, welcoming her to the team and offering his support. It was a small gesture, but one he hoped would set the tone for her tenure. The following week, Gordon attended the leadership workshop. The room was packed with employees from all levels of the company, their diverse perspectives creating an atmosphere of curiosity and collaboration. The guest speaker, a woman with decades of experience in organizational psychology, began by sharing stories of leaders who had challenged traditional norms to create lasting change. Leadership isn't about commanding respect, she said. It's about earning trust. And trust comes from empathy, consistency, and the courage to admit when you're wrong. The words hit Gordon like a bolt of lightning. He thought of Captain Monroe and the quiet authority she had displayed during the flight. She hadn't sought to prove herself to him or anyone else. She had simply done her job with unwavering professionalism, letting her actions speak for themselves. During the breakout session, employees were asked to share moments when they had been challenged to confront their own biases. Gordon hesitated, unsure if he should speak. But as he listened to others share their stories, he felt a nudge, a small, persistent voice telling him this was his moment. When it was his turn, he stood. A few weeks ago, he began, his voice steady but uncharacteristically vulnerable. I boarded a flight with certain assumptions about the crew. I judged the captain based on who she was, not what she was capable of. I doubted her, and I let my biases dictate my perception of her abilities. The room was silent, all eyes on him. Gordon took a deep breath and continued. But when things went wrong, when turbulence hit, and there was a medical emergency, she didn't flinch. She guided us through it with calm, precision, and care. She proved me wrong in every way that mattered. He paused, looking around the room. That experience forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself. And it's why I'm here today, because I don't want to be the kind of leader who judges or doubts without cause. I want to be better. The applause was soft at first, then grew louder, filling the room. Gordon sat down, his face flushed, but his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Over the months that followed, Gordon's leadership began to shift. He became more intentional in his interactions, more willing to listen and learn. He sought out diverse perspectives, encouraging his team to challenge his ideas and share their own. The ripple effect was undeniable. Morale improved, collaboration flourished, and the company began to see results that weren't just measurable on paper, but palpable in the culture they were building. One evening, as Gordon was leaving the office, Clara stopped him. "There's something you should see," she said, handing him a small envelope. "What's this?" he asked, curious. "Just open it," she replied with a smile. Inside was a thank you note from Rachel. In it, she expressed her gratitude for his support and shared how much she was looking forward to contributing to the company's success. At the bottom, she had written a simple but powerful line. "You saw me for what I could do, not for who I wasn't. Thank you." Gordon felt a lump form in his throat as he read the words. It was a reminder of how far he had come, and how far he still had to go. That night, he sat by his window, the city lights twinkling below. He thought of Captain Monroe, of Rachel, of the countless people he had underestimated over the years. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. With that thought, he opened his laptop and began typing. "Dear Captain Monroe, I wanted to thank you again for your professionalism and grace during that flight. Your leadership taught me lessons I didn't know I needed, and they changed the way I approach my work and my life. I hope you know how much of an impact you've made. Sincerely, Gordon Wallace." He hit send, a small smile playing on his lips. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about creating a legacy of trust, empathy, and growth, a legacy worth leaving behind. Closing the circle, weeks turned into months, and Gordon's transformation began to ripple outward. His team noticed the changes first. Meetings became more collaborative, with Gordon actively inviting input rather than dominating discussions. He took the time to listen, not just to ideas, but to concerns, frustrations, and aspirations. One evening during an all-hands meeting, Gordon addressed the company. His speech wasn't filled with corporate jargon or lofty goals. Instead, it was personal. "I've spent years chasing numbers," he admitted. "Targets, profits, and milestones became my compass. But over time, I lost sight of what truly matters. The people who make those numbers possible. I've learned the hard way that leadership isn't about control. It's about trust. And I want to thank all of you for trusting me, even when I didn't always deserve it. I promised to do better." The applause that followed was thunderous, but it wasn't the sound that stayed with him. It was the smiles, the nods of understanding, and the sense of unity in the room. Gordon realized he had earned something far more valuable than respect. He had earned his team's faith. A reunion in the skies. Months later, Gordon found himself at the airport once again, this time for a business trip to Chicago. His attitude toward flying had shifted significantly since that fateful day, though he still felt a twinge of nervousness whenever he boarded a plane. He checked in and made his way to the gate, his briefcase swinging at his side. As he approached the boarding area, a familiar figure caught his eye. Standing near the counter, in a crisp uniform, was Captain Monroe. Her posture was as commanding as ever, her presence unmistakable. For a moment, Gordon hesitated. Would she remember him? Would she even want to talk to him? But then he reminded himself of the lesson he'd learned. Leadership was about courage, even in small personal moments. He approached her, clearing his throat. "Captain Monroe," he said, his voice steady but soft. She turned, her eyes narrowing slightly before recognition dawned. "Mr. Wallace," she said, her tone polite but cautious. "What a surprise." "I just wanted to say thank you," he began, his hands clasped in front of him. "Not just for that flight, but for everything it taught me. You made me realize how much I had to learn, not about flying, but about leadership, about trust." Her expression softened, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I appreciate that," she said. "It's not often we hear how we've impacted someone's life." "You've changed mine," Gordon admitted. "I don't think I can ever repay you for that." "You already have," she replied. "Acknowledgement is more than enough." They exchanged a few more words before boarding was called. Gordon watched as Captain Monroe walked toward the cockpit, her calm confidence radiating as she prepared for another flight. A legacy redefined. Back in his seat, Gordon reflected on how far he'd come. He thought about the countless small changes he'd made, apologizing to his team, advocating for fairness in hiring, mentoring younger employees with empathy instead of authority. Each step had felt like climbing a mountain, but the view from the top was worth it. As the plane ascended, he looked out the window, the sprawling city shrinking below him. He no longer felt the need to control everything. Instead, he felt gratitude for the journey, for the lessons, and for the people who had helped him see the world differently. When the seatbelt sign turned off, he opened his laptop and began drafting a new mission statement for his company. It wasn't about profit margins or market share. It was about creating an environment where everyone felt seen, valued, and empowered to lead in their own way. And as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, Gordon Wallace finally felt at peace, not because he had reached his destination, but because he had found the courage to change.